Now, Ms. Graham, who is the witness today?
The witness this afternoon is Sergeant Scott Maxwell.
Good afternoon, Sergeant.
Afternoon, sir.
You're going to be asked questions by Ms. Graham, whom you'll have met. But before that, would you say the words of the affirmation after me? I solemnly, sincerely and truly
I solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that
I will tell the truth,
I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Ms. Graham.
Thank you. What's your full name?
Scott Maxwell,
And what age are you?
43 years old.
And you're a sergeant?
Yes, that's correct.
And how long have you been a sergeant?
Come up for 4 years now.
How many years service do you have?
Come up for 14 years.
And for a while before you were made a sergeant, were you an acting sergeant?
That's correct, yes.
How long did that period last?
2 or 3 years.
So prior to 4 years ago?
Yeah.
When you were fully promoted?
Yes.
And we'll hear that on the 3rd of May 2015 you were an acting police sergeant at
That's
that
correct,
time.
yes.
Now all of your contact details are known to the inquiry, so I won't be asking you to say those. Have you had the chance to watch some of the other evidence?
Yes, I've seen some of the evidence, so I kind of know the...
So you'll know that in front of you there's a black folder, and there are hard copies of statements in there for you to refer to at any time. And first of all, let's look at a PERC statement 266. And this is a statement dated the 4th of June 2015, taken at 12:40. So this is around 1 month after the events, by Ross Stewart in the presence of Stuart Taylor at Tully Allen. And do you remember giving that statement to PERC?
Yes, I do.
And were you doing your best at that time to give a true and accurate record of what had happened on the 3rd of May?
Yes.
And as well as that, did you have a satellite image that you were given, if you could mark that up? So that's COPFS 91. We'll let you see that on the screen in a moment. It has some markings on it.
Yes, that's correct.
And was that marked up by yourself?
Yes, I've signed and dated it, yes. I'm happy with that.
Okay, good. And then can we look at PERC 267? And I think this is a self-penned statement which you provided to PERC.
Yeah, it was more notes that I made soon after, a few hours after the incident.
So a few hours after on the 3rd of May.
That's correct.
2015.
That wasn't an official statement, that was more notes for myself.
Right. And where were you when you prepared those notes?
In my home address.
Right. And do you remember what time it was?
Oh, it must have been early morning on the 4th. Can't recall exactly.
So it was during the sort of early hours of the following day?
After a few hours sleep.
Right. Okay. And again, although you said they're notes, were they your best recollection of the events on the 3rd of May?
At that time, yeah.
And what did you do with those notes or self-statement?
That was kept my own personal use. I did provide a copy to Professor Watson, my legal representative, when they took over my representation. But other than that, it was for my eyes only.
And did you give a copy to PERC at some point?
Yes, I did. When I got my statement taken at Tully Allen, I provided them with that hard copy.
Thank you. And can we look at your inquiry statement number 44, SBPI 44? And it's headed up response to Rule 8 request, but you'll know I'm calling this your inquiry statement. Yes. So this was in response to almost 100 questions from the inquiry team, which you were then asked to collate a statement or responses to those questions, you and your solicitors, and this is the statement that you sent in.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And can we look at the last page of that, please? And we'll see a paragraph that says, at the end of the questions, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website. And in light of that, you then have signed that we don't have a copy of your signature, but your hard copy should contain
Yes, that's
your
correct.
signature.
That's my signature.
And that was signed on the 21st of April this year. Is
Yes.
that correct?
Yes.
And also, when you gave this statement to the inquiry, were you doing your best to give a true and accurate record of the events of the 3rd of May 2015?
Yes.
Now, the other thing that you might have in front of you is a spreadsheet to your left. And if you've watched any of the other evidence, you may have seen I've been playing some footage of CCTV and Snapchat and dash cams. And this is a spreadsheet containing information of what was contained in the footage. You'll see on the left there's times. To the left of centre there's transcripts of airwaves transmissions, and just to the right of centre there's a sort of thumbnail sketch of what you see in a CCTV footage. So you can please feel free to refer to any of that during your evidence.
Thank you.
Although I'll put statement paragraphs up, it will be maybe one paragraph we see on the screen. If you want to refer me to something else, please just let me know. All right. Can I ask you, first of all, how long you'd been an acting police sergeant by the 3rd of May 2015?
For around a year.
Right. Had you always been based at Kirkcaldy?
I was based at Kirkcaldy, however, part of the role to get experiences to go and cover at different stations. Should another substantive sergeant be used for a specialism, I would go and fill in there and run that response team for that shift.
And had you done that?
Yes, quite a lot, yes.
But largely based at Kirkcaldy?
Yes, that's correct.
And were you in charge of Response Team 4 on the 3rd of May 2015?
Yes.
And although you've talked about your role as acting police sergeant, who was in charge of you, or who was your supervisor?
Police Inspector Kay, he was the patrol inspector for certainly my area and other areas around Kirkcaldy that time.
We may have heard he's based in Dunfermline, is that right? Or was based in
He
Dunfermline?
can be. I believe he was based at Kirkcaldy that day.
So he was present in Kirkcaldy Police
I
Office
believe
that
so.
day?
Yeah.
I believe so. Can I ask you about paragraph 11 of your inquiry statement, please? You're asked about risk factors you considered, and you say from memory, if I can see it. No, I think I've maybe got the wrong paragraph number there. Can I ask you about, it's not that paragraph, could we move up please, Miss Wildgoose? I wanted to ask you about some equipment issues before we move on. So, first of all, you were involved in the muster in
Yes.
the morning. Tell us what a muster is.
What happens is I come in prior to the shift starting, get a handover from, it would be the night shift sergeant. We have what's known as a log of everything that's happened, which contains any custodies we have, any domestic incidents, various, just broken down into categories. So it's a handover for me. It will tell me whether we have any actions that we need to continue from the night shift. If maybe someone has been arrested that requires interview or further inquiry done. So I get that handover. I then work out who's working with who in terms of lineup and allocate tasking out to them. And that sets up my muster. And then I go into that muster and I'll tell the officers what's happened last night, if there's any intelligence briefings we need to know of, and task them out.
And when you say task them out, does that mean allocating them tasks for
Yes.
the day?
So if we had a suspect we were looking for, I might say to one of the units, can I please allocate that to you? Your job today will be to try and trace the suspect and interview and try and bring that to conclusion.
So you're in charge, but they have some autonomy in terms of how they carry out these tasks?
Yes, effectively, I'm in control of the team's business. Officers, when I was an officer as well, I've got autonomy. I'm I make the decisions based on the legislation, law, human rights, etc. I carry out my duties due to that. I am there as a sergeant to oversee if they maybe have a problem, they need advice, if they're needing guidance on something. I'm there to deal with the bureaucratic admin side of it as well. And the calls that are coming in, risk assess them along with the control room, just to manage the team as a whole. But the officers, when they go to an incident, they are wholly responsible for their actions at that particular time. Unless I hear something or whatever that I wish to come in and say, look, actually, can we do it this way?
You can intervene.
I can intervene, but the trust is there. They're fully trained, fully up to speed. When they go to an incident, I shouldn't have to worry about what they are doing. As such, they should know what they're doing.
Okay. And from memory that day, was everyone present who was supposed to be present on the team?
Yes, that I can recall. I had all the staffing that was allocated to me on that day, yeah.
And you've said everyone was trained. Did they all have their officer safety equipment with them?
No one has approached me on that day stating otherwise.
We may have heard, the chair may have heard some evidence that one of the officers did not have a baton, that a clip had been broken the week prior and it hadn't been ordered, a replacement hadn't been ordered, hadn't arrived. So if someone did not have a baton, which is obviously a piece of equipment, is that something they should draw to your attention?
Yes, it should have been.
Yeah. And how do they go about how would someone go about doing that? Would they just speak
They would
to
approach
you?
me, yeah, approach me and say, I would try and source an alternative bit of kit.
And that's something that you could do?
I could certainly try, yeah.
Yeah. If they could not source an alternative source of kit, or they couldn't source a baton or a suitable clip, what should they be doing?
Well, to be honest, if I'd been told that and I had awareness of that, it might have been that we would have talked about other strategies in terms of officer safety. But we had a lot of staff on at that time, and I could have moved that officer onto the diary car, which is more appointment based and least likely to get involved in a confrontation. There's no set purpose as such, there's no set technique, but it's ensuring that they're safe. And if I had been told that, I potentially would have done that rather than let them go out on the street.
So you have a discretion as part of your role to allocate officers with one or other of the team?
Yes.
Right. Can I ask you about the airwaves transmissions? Now, you may have heard some of this if you've watched any of the evidence, but at one point you made a request for all units to attend, for an ARV and for a dog unit.
Yes.
Maybe we could just look at the spreadsheet for the moment, it might assist. If you look at page 2, at 7:17:23, and I wouldn't plan to play this unless you want to hear it, but this says it's yourself, Acting Police Sergeant Scott Maxwell, control from 411. I want all units to attend that, bearing in mind officer safety. Is there an ARV and a dog as well, please?
Yep.
And I'd like to ask you about that. You've said in your inquiry statement you thought this was a grade 1 call. You classified it was classified as grade 1, which meant immediate threat to life.
Yes.
And so what was your understanding of the significance or the seriousness of that call about the man in holding a knife?
Yeah, the information that came over the radio was that there was a male in possession of a knife, and that he was running about the street with it, and that he had been chasing somebody. Soon after that, I believe there was a second call coming in corroborating that. In that instance, for me, that is immediate threat to life. That I can go into later on, but there's certain categories of knife incidents I kind of work across. But for that, being a Sunday morning, it was quite out of the ordinary. Coming in, quite a concerted message that there's a male in possession of a knife chasing somebody. That means immediately someone's life's in danger. No matter what, if it'd been fake, call, whatever, you receive that information, you don't deal with that lightly.
Right. Can I ask you about that? You've talked about chasing somebody.
Yes.
So that's an immediate threat to
Yes.
life. Could you look at page 1, please? At 7:16:32, we see Con 1. So we've heard that this is the control room on the airways transmission. I need you to divert out to Henry Road. A disturbance ongoing. Male armed with a knife, African-looking male chasing someone maybe carrying a knife, described as big with muscles. I think I would like to play from this point, please. So this is the evidence video timeline from 7:16:32. It's just prior to that. You'll hear it coming on. So you can read the transcript and we'll play through to 7:17:10.
I need you to divert to Henry Road, a disturbance ongoing, male armed with a knife, African-looking male chasing someone maybe carrying a knife, described as big with muscles, about 6 feet tall, wearing a white t-shirt and dark coloured jeans. There's an individual coming in about standby. Yeah, well, that's another grade 1 call coming in for the Victoria Road, Kirkcaldy, male armed with a knife. Male in possession of a large knife, a black male wearing white t-shirt and jacket, walking along the street with a large knife in his right hand, about a 9-inch blade.
Thank you very much. So you'll have heard both of those messages. Now in the first one, you've told us just a moment ago that your understanding was that a male armed with a knife was chasing somebody. When you listened to the transmission at 7:16:32 on page 1 of the spreadsheet, we've also heard that this is someone reading off a screen. I need you to divert to Henry Road, a disturbance ongoing, male armed with a knife, African-looking male chasing, and then there's a pause, and then it says someone may be carrying a knife, and then it says described as big with muscles. You're telling us today your recollection is that someone was chasing somebody with a knife. Was that your understanding of that message?
Yeah, they were being chased, and also there was a male in possession of a knife, yes.
So did you understand that message to be someone was a male armed with a knife was chasing somebody?
Yes, that was my understanding.
That was your understanding at the time. If your understanding at the time had been that he was just chasing cars or maybe just walking around the street with a knife, would that have made a difference to how you graded the call?
Not really, no.
You'd still have seen that as immediate threat to life?
I would still have seen that immediate threat to life.
So, immediate threat to life, and you make a request for all units, the ARV and the dog unit. And in making that request, what was your intention? Why did you ask for those things?
One of the jobs as Sergeant as well, I've got to plan for every contingency. My thinking in that is that if I had an armed response vehicle or a dog unit and it was close by, that they could maybe potentially come in and deal with the situation along with us. There's different tactical options, different ways that could have come to a conclusion. Also, when we arrived there, it may have been a standoff situation, potentially maybe suicidal. They might have been a cry for help. So there's different ways. When that call came in, I didn't immediately think that's what was going to happen. But you've got to account for all different possibilities, and having the specialisms of an armed response vehicle or a dog helps with those tactical responses, and also for officer safety and for keeping the public safe as well.
So how can it help with officer safety?
Well, again, it depends how it pans out. If a dog is with you at the scene or locus, the dog may be able to go and deal with the individual rather than a human being having to go and deal and see if they can bring that to a conclusion. There's just different tactics rather than officers having to go face to face with anybody. And again, these specialist officers are trained in this, and obviously the control room is also trained in this, firearms commander, etc. So if they were available, there's a potential that they would take over on scene, and they would deploy their tactics. It's not up to me per se to deploy and use their specialism. They would then, I would seek advice from them when they arrived.
So having them on the scene gives you a wider range of tactical options, including them taking over, taking charge or taking command. And you said if they were close by. So what do you mean by that?
Obviously, when we centralised, and we kind of, depending on where the shifts were starting, etc., would depend on the availability of specialist resources. So one of the reasons I did shout up is to obviously find out where and if there was anyone on duty at that particular time to assist us in that.
Can I ask you to look at Perk 266, which is your Perk statement, page 3, paragraph 11. So that's right at the bottom of the page.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, right, sorry, the 3 up. I also remember asking the controller about the availability of an ARV and a dog unit, and that was basically to assist my officers and through experience. I know that knife incidents may result in a standoff situation or hostage situation, and the ARVs and dog unit may be more appropriate. The initial response I got back was that it would be checked. I remember it took me several radio transmissions to have my request acknowledged. I remember about 5 minutes later the same male controller advised me that there was no ARV on duty and that there was a dog unit on duty and would be attending this call. This reply came when I was off at Locus. And we'll leave that there for the moment. So your understanding was that there was no ARV on duty that day?
At that particular time, yes.
Right. But there was a dog unit on duty and they would be attending?
That was when I was at the actual scene by then, but there'd been no confirmation from any of the controllers stating that there was one en route.
Right. Can I ask you to look at the spreadsheet again, please? So page 2, I referred you to 71723, that was your initial request for all units, ARV and dog unit. And then we see at 71912, you say control from 411, is there any update from ARV or dog units over? So that was you seeking an update from your original request. And then at 71917, con 1, I believe a dog unit is en route, which confirms what you've said. And then con 2, 411, be aware, organising an ARV as well, stand by.
Yeah.
So what was your understanding of that phrase, be aware, organising an ARV as well?
Yeah, that to me confirms that there's no confirmed resource being allocated to the call. They're trying to resource one or find one.
So if there had been one confirmed, what would you have expected control to say to you?
Just confirming that a certain call sign is available and they're making their way from XYZ, ETA, X amount of minutes.
So where with the dog unit, they've said, I believe a dog unit is en route.
Again, that wasn't confirmed.
So what did that mean when you say not confirmed?
Well, I believe a dog unit en route isn't a dog unit is on its way.
Right.
It's not a confirmation.
And as a confirmation about a dog unit, what would you have expected? What information would you have expected?
Again, I would have expected from control, Sierra Delta 1-2 is en route. It's currently in Edinburgh, 40-minute ETA.
Right.
And then that's it, rubber stamp to say there's definitely a resource on the way.
So the identifying number and then an estimated time of
some
arrival.
form of communication to say that they're en route.
So in relation to both the dog unit and the ARV, there was no clarity on that as far as you were concerned. So in terms of your approach to this situation and your mindset, what did you think the situation was with the dog unit, the ARV, the sort of specialist resources?
I didn't believe they'd been allocated, so we didn't have them available.
Right. So you were approaching this incident
without that support.
Without that support. And had there been that support available, had you had that clarity in relation to the allocation and the estimated time, what difference would that have made to the way you approached this incident?
Well, certainly, as I said earlier, in terms of officers having autonomy, we still need to go to the locus and ascertain what's going on. I've asked for the dog unit in the RV as a tactical option as well. The fact that they were 40 minutes away, if they had been available, would still negate of them being readily available. Officers have decided to engage Mr. Bayou at that time rather than communicate. So for me, there's nothing much else I can do as a supervisor in that situation. I've got an ARV dog unit requested, there's no confirmation, officers en route to scene. The main thing for me is that I have staffing available, I've requested the resources to assist, and effectively that's me managing what I can do at that particular time.
So you've effectively reached the limit of your authority.
Yes.
And when you use the words readily available, how close would those specialist resources have to be for them to be readily available?
Well, again, it depends on the circumstances. I mean, the circumstances in this particular incident have played out pretty quick. But if the subject had the knife and engaging with officers, 40 minutes might be plenty of time. It really just depends on what we're faced with.
When you say engaging, what do you mean?
Well, in terms of if the subject is in control in terms of they're speaking to officers, maybe they've got the knife, if they're suicidal, got the knife at their neck, or they're just standing contained, but police have got some sort of verbal control, etc., keeping their distance, then a dog unit or a ARV could potentially make it in time to then affect their tactical options in dealing with the person.
So depending on the circumstances, there could have been a period where they waited for those specialist resources, but it would be dependent on the circumstances.
Absolutely, the way in which it plays out. Every situation is unique.
There's something else that you mention in your PERC statement I just want to ask you about before we move on. PERC 266, page 4, paragraph 1. You mention you don't remember when the last time your CS spray was weighed, or indeed if it has been weighed at all. I've never heard of officers having their CS canisters routinely weighed. I now know that PAVA canisters are weighed daily by the officers themselves and record their weights on a pro forma retained in a team folder in the briefing, basically down to the individual's honesty. Could you explain a little bit about this? We've not heard any evidence so far about weighing.
Yeah, I mean the CS, it was more, you had your CS, you would sign that in and out to say that you had taken that out of the controlled police building, and then it's signed back in at the end of the evening. Can't recall there was any requirement to have that weighed. PAVA was different, where we had to sign it in and out and clarify the weights in and out as well.
Right. And in May 2015, was it your understanding that there was some sort of weighing process being carried out?
Yes, and some were still in CS, were signing in and out because it was just being sort of introduced then.
Thank you. And did you understand that it would have been possible for the area control room to take command of the incident as it panned out in Hayfield Road? Yes,
I mean certainly if it turned in or had been declared a firearms incident, then yes, they would have taken ownership of that. Again, as it panned out in this particular circumstance, it happened in a matter of minutes, and for any ownership as such as my management and the management of the overview, it happened that quick. That personally I can't see how we could have affected much more, other than the officers being autonomous and dealing with within their training.
Mm-hmm. So prior to I'd like to get an understanding of your ability to control a situation before you've actually even arrived at the scene. What does it mean to be in charge or in command of a situation that's ongoing before you even actually arrive yourself.
Yeah, as I said earlier, it's about making sure that you have the correct amount of staff to go to that. If it had been a vandalism at primary school, 1 unit would be suffice. Someone in possession of a knife, it's as many officers as we can get, because it's not just a case of this particular person may be in one area. They could have moved, so we need area search, containment potentially, different type of tactics. So I've got to look at that. I've got to look at specialist resources, ensure that the officers stay safe, and obviously risk assess the area in which it's in as well. So I'm just keeping a complete overview. I'm looking at other factors such as it, you know, has someone left the hospital, especially what the time of the day it is as well. There's numerous factors you need to look into, but ultimately, until we can get there and actually see what's going on, and some feedback or whatever it might be, it's difficult to get a complete overview. I mean, I could have said to them, no one go near that area. However, we need to see what's going on at that particular time.
Is it possible for you to say to officers, I want you to wait, to hold back and observe what's going on?
I mean, potentially I could have said that, yes. However, as I said before, officers that were heading there are extremely experienced officers, and they know what to do with in that set of circumstances. They know that when they get there, if it's a situation they can't deal with, or they feel that I need to know about straight away, they would contact me over the radio or let control know.
So it's open for all of those officers to provide, we've heard it called feedback?
Well, some sort of feedback. What I would normally do is when I get to scene, I would say, that's me here. I can see a particular individual. They're in possession of they're not in possession, etc. Some sort of feedback. However, in this case, officers have deemed it suitable enough to go and deal with the incident, and have approached Mr. Bayou by themselves without providing any feedback to myself at the control room.
We've heard evidence that there wasn't feedback to the control room, but also other officers in the area, such as yourself,
Yes.
can also hear those airwaves
Yes.
transmissions. We've also heard that the officers who attended were up to date in their training.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sounds like you're relying to some extent on their training and their experience to allow them to act with autonomy when they arrive at the scene.
I wouldn't use the word relying. They're trained professionals. I supervise a team of trained professionals. I'm not relying or hoping that they deal with it. I know they will deal with it professionally.
Okay. And you might be 2 or 3 minutes behind those officers. Yes. So what are your expectations of the officers when they first arrive at a scene?
Well, again, as I've said, the two officers that did arrive first at the scene were extremely experienced, and I had full trust in them.
We've heard they may have been the most experienced.
Yes, they were. They were. Yeah. Now, through all that experience, I was very confident in their assessment of what the situation would be, and I was confident that they would deal with that situation in a professional manner and let me know if there's anything in particular I need to know about straight away. For other officers attending, but also for me, and to be recorded on our call card system, which you've seen, which is here. Anything that's pertinent should be recorded on this for circumstances as reviews, etc., or review of training progress.
Things like the airwaves transmissions.
Yeah, yeah. Now, they've decided to engage Mr. Bayou. Officers knew, they shouted up that they were at the scene, at the locus, and the way they've dealt with it, they've thought they could deal with it initially, and they haven't shouted back up. But personally, I would have preferred some form of feedback to say, we're here, we can see this, we're going to get out and engage. And that sets the scene to everybody.
So we've heard you weren't present at the scene at that time,
No.
at the time they arrived. And we've heard from the control room that they needed eyes on the ground
Yes.
to be able to see what was happening. And they wanted that so they could get more information to process that through this national decision-making model.
That's correct.
And is that the sort of thing that you're also doing, getting more information in to
Yes.
then go around the national decision-making model?
Yes, that's correct. The more information we have at our disposal, the more informed decisions we could make.
So although you were confident in your officers and their assessment, you would have liked further information from them.
As I says, I would have liked that. It's not necessary, because if every officer was to go to every call and give you feedback, you wouldn't get anything done. Because there's calls coming in, I'm here, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. But in this particular call, I might have expected some form of feedback.
Because this is a grade 1 call.
Yes.
And you've called for an ARV and a dog unit in all units.
That's correct.
So it's a high priority call,
Yep,
which you've considered to be an immediate threat to life.
that's correct.
So basically, would you expect as much information to be shared as possible?
Yes.
In those circumstances?
As much as I can, based on the circumstances that the officers are met.
Mm-hmm. And although you've told us earlier that you can issue instructions prior to your arrival, would you have considered that appropriate without any feedback from the officers on the scene?
Again, I'd worked with the team for a while. I covered the team, so I know how each individual works. If it maybe been two probationers new to service that were teamed together and had gone in to a situation like that, I would have been more vocal. But again, it's down to the experience and trust of the professional officers you have at your disposal. When they've gone, I've felt confident that I had my best people go in to deal with that, and that they would pass back what was pertinent to me to us helping us. They also knew that the request had been made for specialist resources and that other officers were en route as well.
So they would know that you expect some feedback if they
Yes.
can. And would they know that ACR expects some feedback?
Yes, yeah. As I say, it's not necessary, but again, it would probably be the best practice in terms of making everyone aware.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you, you left Kirkcaldy Police Office to go to the scene at
Yes.
Hayfield Road. And was that 2 or 3 minutes behind the others in your team?
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you have quite a bit of discretion about who's put with who. Can you tell us, when you're pairing up the officers, we've heard that Walker and Payton went out together, we've heard that Tomlinson and Short went out together, Smith went with Good, who was a probationer. We've heard about Tomlinson, Short, Smith and Good, Gibson and McDonough, sorry, I'm forgetting. And we've heard about Gibson going out with McDonough. Is it you that decides to who to pair?
Yes, to an extent. So PC Smith and Good. PC Smith was PC Good's tutor constable, so we try and keep them together as much as possible. You try and the fact is, you don't make judgments. They're all professionals. They all know what they're doing. They're fully trained. Obviously, some are more experienced than others, and you try to marry up the experience. Okay, it might be a case where you've got two people just out probation, and you put them on together because they need to get the experience, and they work together to build the expertise in their job role. So it is up to me essentially who goes out, unless. I was an acting sergeant at the time, so I was covering, unless I'm left specific instructions to say this pairing must work together, this pairing must work together. But there's no set formula for pairing officers together. And ideally you try and keep them together as much as possible, because if they're dealing with a particular case and one of them goes off sick, the other person has knowledge of that case if they get hold of the suspect or have to take other statements. So it's best practice to offer best customer service that way.
So continuity is important.
If possible.
From the outside, you might think that someone very experienced should be paired with someone slightly less experienced to help bring that person on. That's not what you're saying. You're talking about marrying up experience.
You can do. You can have marrying up experience, but you can also have people that are out their probation. I found it very useful when I was out my probation. I was put in a car myself, and I went out and dealt with incidents, and I learned a lot quicker. I made mistakes. I did good work, but I learned a lot quicker. You work with someone a bit younger service than you. You feel that you are the person in charge, and you develop a lot quicker. And your understanding. So it's not just about marrying experience, it's about building officers' confidence as well.
Right. So does that explain why Walker and Peyton, the most experienced officers, were put out together?
Yes, I mean there was
others?
other reasons as well. They had certain casework they're doing. I tend to put them out on what's known as the 1-9 van crew. They're in charge of the warrants, and they would go around and get the warrants as well because they had the custody van. So there's a lot of operational reasons as well, which I won't go into today unless I have to. But really, there's no specific formula. It's about your priorities at the time when you turn up.
So there's not a simple answer to how you pair people?
No. Well, the simple answer for the tutor cop and the officer is for that reason. But other than that, there's no set formula.
Not for the others?
No.
And can I ask you to look at a message that we've heard evidence about on page 3 of the spreadsheet, 7/20/13. Inspector Stewart, Area Control Room, to the set attending. I am monitoring this obviously from an ARV perspective. If you get sightings of the male, you need to make an initial assessment yourself and feedback through straight away, and I'll listen out on the channel. And looking at that message, what does that say to you as an officer?
Well, that's the Area Control Room inspector stating that he's looking for a bit of feedback, like I was, but also from an ARV perspective. He's the Tactical Firearms Commander, and for the information that he would potentially get from the scene would determine whether or not that the ARV was required and it met the criteria to dispatch it to our area.
And again, he's expecting feedback from officers on the scene?
Again, if needed.
And can I ask you to have a look at paragraph 2 and paragraph 3 of your inquiry statement, please? Let's look at 2 first of all. So here you're asked about the receipt of the call and the grade 1 call and the immediate threat to life. We've talked about that already. Can I ask you to look at paragraph 3, please? And I'd just like you to look at paragraph 2 of that answer, first of all. And there's a reference to 1 unit alone would not have been sufficient to carry out full street searches, and once found to assess, control and contain the subject. I also had in mind the contact and cover principle. So I'd just like to ask you about the assess, control and contain the subject.
Yes.
And then the contact and cover principle. Can you explain to us what you meant by those phrases?
Yeah, certainly. We obviously had the reports of a male in possession of a knife in that area. It's a mixture of main arterial routes to hospitals and housing estates, etc. So there's lots of different places that a potential suspect could move off into. So again, 1 unit alone, and certainly I would have been irresponsible sending 1 unit alone to look for a male armed with a knife. Should anything happen, and then I'm having to explain why I only sent 1 unit. So we're sending as many people as we can, carry out a street search, and then as we talked about before, potentially to feed back and see where that person is. Would it be possible to control and contain the subject? And contact and cover in terms of approaching the male from an officer safety point of view.
So can you explain what you mean by contact and cover?
Contact and cover is effectively an officer safety technique whereby one officer may talk to the subject and try and gain their attention while the other officer's coming at a different angle should be required to restrain or use any other officer safety techniques. So there's one person's focused on one individual, so it leaves that other officer, because if we both approach at the same side at the same time, and the potential both could get injured or incapacitated. So it's an officer safety technique. And
so the officer in front of the subject will communicate with them or attempt to communicate with them. I speak to them. Yeah, another one's there as a precautionary measure should it go wrong. If something goes wrong, they can take a different angle. Yes. And then assess, control and contain, what does that mean? Again, that would have been if it was in a position to do such like, again, if the subject was standing stationary, it might be a case of we get out, try and contact them, speak to them, and other officers may form a form of cordon to try and keep them in that particular area so it's not a risk to anyone else. How many officers would you need to contain one subject? It depends on the location itself. It really is dependent on that, where you are, how many officers you've got. The scenario I was thinking about in my head at that time is when you get somebody in a street scenario where you can have both ends closed. I mean, if they run through the garden, you know, at least you've got officers in that area that can then double back and come back and try and sort of trace them again. There's no easy answer to that one, but it's to form some form of cordon and show police presence. What about Hayfield Road? How many officers would you need to contain a subject in Hayfield Road? You would need quite a lot, to be honest. To put a full cordon on an inside and outer cordon, you're looking at over 20 officers. How many were in response team 4? There was 8, I believe. And then obviously we could have got officers from other areas and if it had been required. Right. That isn't something that you anticipated at that stage? Again, very early stages of that, right at its infancy. Until you get there and see what's happening, then it's very difficult. So again, it's very important to see what's happening on the ground. I mean, if every incident you were to ask for 20 officers from another area, I think you would not be favourably received. Can we look at paragraph 5, please? You'll see that's split into different paragraphs. You're asked about the perpetrator's race here. The race had no bearing whatsoever on how the incident was managed. I would have responded to a credible threat to life call in the same manner, no matter the description of the perpetrator. For the avoidance of doubt, and because I know the inquiry is going to examine this issue, I was aware of the threat level to national security and police officers as being severe, and that there had been high-profile incidents in relation to terrorism in the United Kingdom. However, my risk assessment at that time did not take terrorism into account and only would have if credible evidence was available. I'd like to explore this in more detail with you. You say that because you know the inquiry is going to examine this issue, you're mentioning your awareness of the threat level. Yes. So is that only because the inquiry is going to examine it, or was this something that you considered on the day? As I said, when the initial call came in, it's my job to think of every sort of avenue, contingency, what's going on, and obviously the nature of it with all the heightened security and terrorism, that did go into my mind. But however, at that time there was no credible evidence to suggest that was the case until we actually arrived at scene and see what actually happens. Mental health, death by suicide, lots of different contingencies. If I wasn't doing that, I wouldn't have been doing my job right. And when you say credible evidence, only would have taken terrorism into account, only would have if credible evidence was available. What is it you envisage by credible evidence? Well, if the information that had been received had been terrorism related, there may have been religious, remarks, or if the witnesses have been phoning in, something that would indicate a terrorism threat. Right. And what did your risk assessment take into account, if not race, if not terrorism?
Sorry, just repeat my risk assessment.
You said my risk assessment at that time did not take terrorism into account and only would have if credible evidence was available. So if your risk assessment didn't take race into account and if it didn't take terrorism into account, what did it take into account?
It took into account that there was a male armed with a knife running through the streets, chasing people. Again, which is not a very, it's a very rare occurrence. And again, that was my main priority, make sure we had enough staff, specialist resources, and trying to find the person first off.
Okay.
But as I say, mental health, the terrorism part, you know, anything could have come into play there.
Can I ask you to look again at your notes?
Yeah.
267, page 4. And it's paragraph, well, the paragraphs aren't easy to decipher, but paragraph 3, I was going to say. We can go through from the beginning, actually. You talk about the team at paragraph 2 being in shock and being upset. You see on arrival at the canteen, so you've mentioned that.
Okay.
It's on the screen, and you see you'd not seen them so upset and in shock.
Yep.
They were in fear for their lives and the life of their fellow colleague P.C. Short, who'd been attacked by the male.
Yes.
We moved down a little bit, and you say you were required to give hugs and reassurance to male officers who are strong-willed and not easily fazed. And if we could move down a bit, you say they may never have seen their families again. So, and move down a little. And then I strongly believe, sorry, come back up a little bit. I strongly believe that the officers involved were faced with an extremely hostile and dangerous situation, and that the actions described to me were fully justifiable. So, fully justifiable, you understand that officers who use force have to justify that use of force. Yes,
they have to be a full account of their actions.
So the phrase fully justifiable is a reference to that?
Yeah, they've looked at all other options and they've deemed it proportionate and necessary to use that force.
Right. So you know that to justify the use of force, they have to have used the minimum force necessary?
Yes.
That it has to be proportionate, as you've just
yes.
said, and reasonable?
Yes, and necessary, yeah.
And then it goes on to say, a part of me considered this to be terrorism-related incident based on recent intelligence and the threat level to serving police officers in the UK.
Yeah.
So it seems to indicate that you had considered that it was terrorism-related based on recent intelligence.
Yeah. Again, these notes were made very early on in the morning after it. I don't consider that to be, I consider my PERC statement to be more accurate.
Right.
I did consider terrorism, but I've maybe not said it in such a articulate way there.
Right. So you did consider terrorism, and that you say that was based on recent intelligence and the threat level. Do you want to explain?
The threat level being severe, basically indicating an attack on the UK territory very likely. We were given safety briefings, and as a supervisor I was made very clear to make sure my officers were following that for their own safety and to be aware of that and make sure they're complying with that. So again, that seed was planted as such in my head, and obviously when that call came in, to be honest, it could have come in to any other call as well, of any large disturbance or anything like that, but it did come into this, my risk assessment.
So it came into your mind,
yes.
It came into your risk assessment?
Yeah.
And it may be suggested that if it's a terrorist incident, that police officers are justified in using more force. Is that something you would agree with?
I wouldn't say justified in using more force just based on its terrorism. You still need to go and assess the situation. I wouldn't say that you have to immediately go and your threat level's up here.
So again, it's all about getting information at the scene and factoring that into your national decision-making model.
Yes, yes.
And for some officers, we've heard evidence that they didn't connect this knife incident with terrorism. Do you think that that connection there that we see is because of your senior role as an acting sergeant?
Yeah, well, at the end of the day, some of the officers were still young in service. The briefs I had got, etc., was to make sure that I look after the community in which we serve and the officers, and we do get messages in relation to that, keeping people safe in terms of coming to their work in plain clothes rather than identifying yourself as a serving officer. So if it is in front of you a lot more, you will consider it.
And that's the position you were in?
Yeah.
And then to go back to you when you're travelling en route, you went yourself?
Yes.
You weren't paired with anybody
No.
that day? And what car were you driving?
It was a marked Vauxhall Corsa,
Do you remember what the colour of it was?
just white with the police embossed markings.
And as you travelled there, I think in your statement you said you became aware that Peyton's emergency status had been switched on.
I now know that it was Craig Walker. When the emergency is notified on your radio, in order to actually look and see who it is, you need to actually take your eyes off the road. And I just heard Mail's voice, which I thought to be Alan Payton at the time. But if I really wanted to check, I would have to take my eyes off the road, which would be extremely dangerous. So.
But you're driving en route to Hayfield Road.
Yes.
Your team have arrived already.
Yes.
And you know that an emergency button's
Yes.
been pressed. And did you know that one or two had happened?
I just believe it was one. I don't know, sometimes the radio, if you press 2, there's already one activated. So
We've heard that Peyton's button was pressed and Tomlinson's was pressed.
yeah, I only got the one notification through when I heard officer down, injured.
Right. So let's look at the spreadsheet for a moment. And you see on page 4 of the spreadsheet at 7:21:02, it says officers injured, PC short mail. That's page 4 of the spreadsheet. You got that? And we've heard evidence that that was PC Peyton.
Oh, right, okay. I got this wrong. I thought it was PC Walker that made the transmission, but it was actually PC Peyton.
Well, let's listen to it, because
Can't remember what I put.
so that's 7:21:02, and you can tell us now what you think.
Yeah.
Control, keep off, that's somebody activated the emergency button. Officer injured, PC shot, rail.
Can we just pause it there?
Yeah, that's Alan Payton, yeah.
That's Alan
Yeah,
Payton.
yes,
Thank you.
apologies.
No, not at all, not at all. So there, you'll see just shortly prior to that, at the bottom of page 3, you'll see in red it says PC Alan Payton's emergency status is turned on. And that's at 7:20:42. Then the officer's injured, PC short mail message on page 4 that we've just listened to. And then after that, at 7:21:21, you'll see PC Ashley Tomlinson's emergency status is turned to on. Which one were you aware of?
It was the one by PC Payton, the very first one.
The first one. You weren't aware of Tomlinson's being turned
No.
on. And you were still driving to the scene at that time. When you realise an emergency button or emergency status is on, what was going through your mind at that time?
It's obviously extreme worry. I knew it was either one of Alan or Craig, who are my most experienced officers, and who wouldn't use an emergency button unless there was something extremely wrong. I believe I shouted up where the locus was exactly, so I knew exactly where to go. And then basically, because I was so close to it by then, I just continued making my way to assess the scene myself, rather than clutter the airwave transmissions in case there had to be more emergency messages passed.
Do you want to look at page 4? At 7:21:13, we see that your airways transmission at that time says, "What's the locus?"
Yeah.
Is that what you're just referring to?
Yes, yeah.
So this is after Peyton's emergency status is on and the message "officers injured,"
Yeah.
PC short, has been made. So you're checking what the locus is at that time.
Yeah.
So you're still on your way there. And then I think 7:21:48, which is on the next page, page 5. You say you're 30 seconds out. That's till you arrive at the scene. And then 7:21:55, you'll see Stephen K. P.S. Maxwell, can you arrive there and give me an update, please? So at this point, there's been no updates given. And you've told us the importance to you of getting an update or feedback. You've explained the ACR. Does it now look like Stephen K. is actually looking for an update and he's asking you to give
Again, when you're sitting en route to an incident or in an office at that instance, you're trying to get as much information as possible to assist. So yes, it's likely he's wanting to know exactly what's going on.
So why is he asking you specifically, P.S. Maxwell, can you arrive there and give me an update, please?
I think what he means by that is because I've said I'm literally at locus, he's wanting me to provide a supervisor's update to him as soon as I get there.
And what's a supervisor's update?
I was just, I would say it would potentially give a more strategic situation of what's going on, what we might need resource-wise, who's injured. I think anyone injured, life-threatening. It's so he can risk assess as well.
So are you still in charge of things at that point, not Stephen K?
Again, the charge question is I'm in overall charge of Team 4. We're aware an incident's happened. I'm not there yet. I don't know exactly what's happened. Inspector K is not entirely sure what's happened. So technically, the charge is still at the locus with officers. I know
With officers at the scene.
It's difficult to explain. But until I get there in some sort of supervisory capacity, I can't affect much.
So until you see for yourself what's happening, you don't feel in a position to change what's going on?
Well, I can't offer anything other than what I'm hearing as well as everyone else.
All right, thank you. And is that the same for Stephen K and the same for the control room?
Yes.
But you understood that from Stephen K's perspective, he wanted you to give him an update when you arrived. And then at 7:22:04, do we see just very shortly after that message from Stephen K that Samantha Davidson provides an airwaves transmission? We're just approaching and I'll give you an update. So did you hear that?
I can't actually recall if I heard that as such. Was that long ago? I don't know if I've not put it in my statement. I can't.
It's 9 seconds after your message starts.
It's potentially. I was driving in response mode at the time, so. And
we've heard other people describe you're using the phrase "the response mode." What does that mean for
effectively, you've got advanced driver training that you can drive up to 20 miles an hour over the speed limit to make progress to get to emergency scene. But within that training, you've got to maintain a good overview of the in front of you, so you can react to certain situations a lot more. And it's to make sure you're making progress safely.
And so we've heard that DS Davidson and DI Connell were travelling, or DC Connell, sorry, were travelling together to Haywood Road as well as everyone else.
Yeah.
And they're CID officers, is that right?
Yeah.
Right.
To be honest, I wasn't even aware they were on that day. That was probably my ignorance of not checking that morning.
No, that's fine. So this was news to you that they would even be at Hayfield Road?
I expected just to be myself and my team.
Right. And then we see at 7:22:24, we see that Craig Walker gives an airways transmission update, mailing cuffs still struggling. Right. By this time, sorry, I should have pointed out at the top of page 5, 7:21:38, PC Smith has said, officer's been punched to the back of the head, no obvious serious injuries, male secure on the ground.
Yes.
So he was already on the ground before you even arrived at the scene?
That would suggest so, yeah.
Yeah. Can I ask you, before I move on to you actually arriving at Hayfield Road, can I ask you about something in your PERC 267, your notes? And I'm interested in page 2, paragraph 1. And paragraph 1, at the end of that paragraph, you say, I communicated the stay safe message to officers in attendance. This meant that officers should not engage unless absolutely necessary. Now, these are obviously your notes, but I'm trying to work out what your stay safe message was. Now, we've got the messages on the spreadsheet, and could you have a look through those first few pages and tell us which message of yours is it that you mean when you say you communicated your stay safe message?
I'm trying to find the exact one. Okay, it's the transmission at 071723.
071723.
Yeah, bear in mind.
So that's page 2 of the spreadsheet. And you say, I want all units to attend that, bearing in mind officer safety. Is there an ARV and a dog as well, please?
During those notes, that's what I believed. I'd sent out a more substantial stay safe message rather than that, but so that effectively was it. Officers, more experienced officers, would already know what they were going to, etc. And I've said that.
So when you use the words bearing in mind officer safety, is that sort of trigger in you for other officers that they understand that officer safety is to be prioritised?
Certainly, when I was still involved operationally, but any call that involves a knife, you don't really need the stay safe message. It's almost just me as a supervisor trying to get that across. I know if I'm going to any call, I need to stay safe, but especially anything to do with a confirmed knife or a knife. Sometimes the control room send out a stay safe message as well, just depending on how things are moving.
Okay. So we've still got the PERC notes on your the notes that you prepared, PERC 267 on the screen. And you say, I communicated the stay safe message to officers in attendance. This meant that officers should not engage unless absolutely necessary. And it's that last part that I'm interested in. You said officers should not engage unless absolutely necessary. What did you mean by that? Again,
that's probably poorly worded. If part of the stay safe message is to approach if safe, and engage as safe. That's what I meant to get across there. It's not saying that I'm telling you not to go anywhere near the subject. Right. I think it's not been put very well there. But basically, it's for if I'm going to that scene, I can look at the subject and go, right, okay, I feel safe enough to start some dialogue or approach. I'll do that.
So again, is it about the individual officer making an assessment based on what they see at the scene?
Yeah.
And for that officer to decide whether they feel it's safe to approach or safe to engage.
Yeah. I would never say to an officer, don't go and speak to them if I'm not there. It's up to them, risk assessment. When I was responding to calls, I would use my training and risk assessment of a situation to know whether, right, I'm not going anywhere near that, or I'll stand off, or I'll try and engage or approach.
Would you, at that time, have felt comfortable in saying to an officer, wait, observe from a distance, or stay back?
Again, I could have. Again, sometimes when you're going to an incident like that, you need to try and keep radio traffic down to a minimum. I had extremely experienced officers going to that, and they might think I'm being overprotective by saying stuff like that.
Okay. You don't want to be overprotective?
Well, as such, sometimes I've said it myself, when you hear messages, it goes, I know. But at the same time, it's, again, I have experienced officers there, and I had no reason to think that they were going to do anything out with their training or anything to put themselves at any risk.
Okay. In terms of the words there, in what circumstances would it be considered absolutely necessary to approach somebody or engage with somebody?
Officers should engage.
They should engage.
If there's a possibility to bring that situation to an end quickly, swiftly, if you get there and they've got a knife, or there's a knife next to them and you can safely say, I could get to that knife before them, you could do that. Again, I could sit here and talk to you forever about different scenarios, what ifs, but if there was a member of the public that was in immediate danger, I certainly would go and take action.
Okay.
But again, that's heavily risk assessed in your own head.
And can I ask you about communication? We've heard a lot about having a discussion with somebody when you arrive, tactical communications we've heard about. Is that the sort of engagement that officers can carry out or perform?
It's one of the tactics, yes, absolutely.
Without actually approaching the person or touching them or using any sort of force?
Yes.
And is that something that's encouraged and prioritised?
Absolutely. We work on officer safety training. The mark of trying to get a resolution to any scenario is trying to get engagement with them. I say some circumstances don't dictate that, more extreme circumstances. But if you've got a chance to engage with them and speak to them, then yes, ideal. You want to speak to them, find out what the issue is, if it's something we can help with, and try and resolve it without any further issues.
Are there time limits on that type of engagement and approach?
Well, not really. If the subject is cooperating and is engaging with you, but if you've got a subject who's not engaging and walking towards you, running towards you, or running away from you, then tactical communications clearly failed.
Okay. So what would you say when you've used the words cooperation or engagement, if the person's cooperating with you, what type of thing would you expect to see in someone who was cooperating or engaging?
Eye contact, answering your questions, potentially confiding in you, saying, look, I don't want to speak to you, can I speak to a female officer, or vice versa. There's some sort of engagement between the two. There's give and take. There's something going on there. It might be as simple as just like yes, no answers, but you can build on that.
What if there's no eye contact or no verbal engagement? How long would you try to communicate?
Well, again, there's no prescriptive time. Again, if they're not causing any threat to me or any member of the public, then I would continue. It will get to some point, however, though, you might have to take some more, positive action to bring it to resolution.
And what would happen to make that time occur, where you have to then take positive action?
Well, I mean, if you've been, there's a process in terms of we might have got a negotiator out who's trained specifically to try and get a reaction. But again, that's all based on your subject being compliant. It might be the case that we've got other measures in place that by then You may have had a dog unit in the ARV present, so if they were to then become assaultative or aggressive, then you've got that tactical option. Again, there's no specific, you just have to take each scenario uniquely.
What if the person's not assaultative or aggressive, but isn't communicating verbally with you?
At the end of the day, if they're not communicating and the negotiator's not working, you might just have to go and put hands on. We don't know what's going on with that person. Okay, we've got a duty of care to that person as well. Usually, if they're not communicating like that, there's potentially a underlying issue. Whether it be alcohol, drugs, mental health, something like that.
And is that something officers are trained to be aware of?
Yeah, and it's something that they build up through their experience, through being on the street as well and actually going out to calls.
So experienced officers maybe be better able to identify those
I wouldn't,
things?
that's a loose statement. However, you get some people that have maybe worked in the mental health background before joining the police. We can't discount that, but you can usually tell, and it's more apparent as you get more service that you can recognise that a bit better, but not always.
Right, thank you. I'd like to talk about your arrival at Hayfield Road. Can we look at 7/22/25 on the spreadsheet? So we're back to page 5. And you'll see that the entry next to 7/22/25 says, a smaller marked police car arrives at the scene, approaching going north on Henry Road towards the roundabout. The vehicle does a hard right just prior to the roundabout and stops just off the roundabout into Hayfield Road and just before another marked police vehicle that arrived earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to play the footage of this and I'm going to ask you some questions about it.
Certainly.
Thank you. So we'll start at 7/22/25. And we'll play to maybe 33, maybe 10 seconds, thanks.
Update Bill! And just still struggling! Control!
Thank you. Did you see that vehicle arriving from Henry Road? And
Yes.
turning right into Hayfield Road on the wrong side of the road?
Yes.
Who was that?
I can only assume that it was myself from my statement.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever run that fast before though, but that's certainly, I think that's me, yeah.
But you think that is you, your
Yeah.
car. And the person coming out of that car then runs towards the scene which is playing out slightly up Hayfield Road. Yeah. And if we look on to page 6 of the spreadsheet at the very top, it says, during this time, the officer that exited the marked vehicle arrives at the other group of officers and appears to move around the group walking first, towards the end of the group nearest the residential properties, and then further round back towards the road. And we may need to go back to 33 to just show that section. We'll just play that.
Control!
And did you see yourself
Yeah.
going round and then round to the sort? We've heard the top of Mr. Bio, the head of Mr. Bio was nearer the hedge. Was that what you recollect?
Yes.
And so that was your arrival at the scene, and you were the 5th police car to arrive.
Okay.
And do we see on the reconstruction tile at the top on the footage that there is now a car sort of parked just to the right of the roundabout?
Yes.
Behind a vehicle we've heard was called the diary car,
Yes.
and that was your Vauxhall Corsa.
Yes.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look at some images on a 3D Reconstruction Images. You'll have seen with other witnesses that I've asked them to look at this. And I'd like to ask you some questions about what was happening when you arrived. And it may assist if we look at still images 2, images 6 or 7. So let's look at 6 first of all, please. So you'll see that there are 2 cars on the left-hand side of this image.
Yeah.
One part on the markings of the road near the roundabout, and one part slightly in Hayfield Road,
Yes.
near to the pavement. Now, looking at that car on the far left, closest to the roundabout, does that seem a reasonable indication of where you parked?
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And can you tell us when you got out of the car, where was Mr. Bio?
Do you want me to put the...
You can touch the screen and a red circle will appear. And if you don't like the position,
Right.
Miss Wildgoose will remove it.
It was
So he was
lying
there.
on the pavement there with his head nearest the bush, the south side, with his feet towards the northern end, nearer the road.
Near the road. And which officers could you see when you got to that point?
It was Alan Smith, Ashley Tomlinson, Craig Walker, PC Payton, and Daniel Gibson.
So Smith, Tomlinson,
Smith,
Walker,
Tomlinson, Walker, Payton,
Payton and Gibson.
Gibson, and I'm sure McDonough was in and around.
McDonough. Tell us what they were all doing. Let's start with Smith.
I believe when I got there, he was to the east side of Mr. Bio, who was on his left side.
So you've arrived from, we see here, the left-hand side.
Yes.
And we've heard that the pavement side is known as the south
Yes.
side.
Yes.
And the grassy tree area is known as the north.
Yes.
And so the west would be where the roundabout was.
Yep.
And the east would be further along Hayfield
Yes.
Road where the hospital is.
was, yeah.
Right. So tell us, thinking about Smith first of all, tell us where PC Smith was.
The best of my recollection, he was kneeling down on the east side of Mr. Bayou, on his knees, near the head.
Near the head.
Yeah.
And what was he doing at that time?
I can't recall as such. I believe at that time he was in cuffs that I can recall, and they were just making sure that he was stable and that he was supporting the head, I believe, to make sure that that wasn't subject to any banging or anything like that, which is part of the hold process.
So you're saying supporting the head and you're moving your hands in front of you. The chair might not be able to see that because of the screen.
And that's a sort of supportive manner.
You've got your palms out
yeah,
in front of you.
just to make sure that if there's any further struggle, he doesn't bang his head.
Right. Was there anything under his head at that point?
No.
Can I just understand that? Are you saying that the officer had his hands under the head of
I believe so. I believe so when he arrived.
which part of his head?
Just the back. It was on the side, so it was just making sure it was safe, not touching the road. So ushering sort of motion.
Thank you.
How was Mr. Bio lying when you arrived at the scene?
He was on his left-hand side. I think he'd just been put onto his left-hand side.
And which direction was he facing?
He was facing west towards Gallagher's pub, where I walked in from.
And so you're telling us about PC Smith holding or ushering under his head.
Yeah.
And by this time you said Mr. Bio had cuffs on.
Yes.
Where was he cuffed?
To the front.
His arms were to the front.
Yes.
And you've said that PC Smith was kneeling near the head area.
Mm-hmm.
Where was PC Tomlinson?
I think he was to his right-hand side on the east side, so
Is that to
it
PC
was as
Smith's
if he was
right?
north of PC Smith.
North of PC Smith.
Yeah.
And you've said PC Smith was at Mr. Bio's head.
Yes.
How is it that PC Tomlinson could be at his right but north of PC Smith?
Well, if PC Smith's at his head at the side, then, so if he's here, PC Tomlinson stays right.
Oh, so PC Tomlinson was to PC Smith's right-hand
Yes.
side. What area of Mr. Bio
I think it
was
was
he
like
in?
the upper
Close to-
chest, sort of waist area.
Right. What was he doing?
He was down on his knees also. I think he was leaning over, just stabilising them, Mr. Bayou.
How was he stabilising?
Just with his arms, just bringing them, keeping them in that position.
On his left-hand side?
Yes.
Where was PC Walker?
He was standing up at the time.
Where was he standing?
I can't remember exactly if it was behind PC Tomlinson or behind PC Smith.
Was he doing anything?
No.
Where was PC Payton?
Again, standing up behind Smith and Tomlinson.
So up towards the head area?
Yeah.
Doing anything at that
No.
stage?
Both were clearly under the distress from looked like PAVA or CS contaminant.
So did they have red eyes?
Yeah, sort of snotty, red eyes, teary.
Right. PC Gibson, where was he?
Sure, he was on the legs of Mr. Bayou.
When you say on the legs, what do you mean?
In a hold, whereby I believe he had his weight on the legs, and he puts his arm underneath, just to contain the legs to make sure there's no kicking or further lashing out.
And PC McDonough?
I can't recall if he was down near the legs or he was standing up at that time.
When you arrived, you've talked about seeing handcuffs. What about fast straps?
I believe they were also applied.
So they'd also been applied. Where to on Mr. Bio?
Down at the sort of ankle area.
Only the ankle area?
That's the only one I can specifically recall.
Could you see his knee area?
Again, I would have been able to see it. I can't recall whether or not they were on at that. But I knew there was a strap on, but I don't know if there was two or one, unless it's in my statement. But
What was PC McDonough doing?
I say I can't recall either. He was down near the legs or he was standing just off to the side.
At any time after you arrived, did you see Mr. Bio in the prone position?
Not that I can recall, no. There was just on the side. To my best of my recollection, when I arrived there, he's been moved up onto he was getting moved onto the side, sort of like as a recovery position.
How long after you arrived did you become aware that Mr. Bio was unconscious?
I need to refer to my statement, but once I'd ascertained that Mr. Bayou had been controlled and he was getting suitably looked after by PC Smith, I then went to see Nicole Short because I was aware she'd been involved in the officer down scenario. So I believe it was when I came back from that I'd been made aware that I was unconscious.
Right. So how long did you stand in the area of Mr. Bio before you left to go and see PC Short?
Might have been 30 seconds, can't really say specifically. Everything was going so fast. I was trying to take in everything at once.
We've heard some people say it went very quickly and they had difficulty judging the time.
Yes, the time is something that was out the window.
Right. So you arrived where Mr. Bio was. You then went to see PC Short. Why did you not remain with Mr. Bio?
I had PC Smith, who was an officer safety trainer and first aid trainer, was in control of the situation. He wasn't unconscious at that time and he was breathing. I know it sounds silly, but it seemed like a standard scenario at that time in terms of dealing with custody that's kicked off. Conscious breathing, just waiting on getting them into the custody van. And I was aware, obviously, one of my officers had been injured, so I had to then go and check on them to make sure if they were needing any medical assistance. And also, I needed to know myself what was going on.
So you've said you knew that Mr. Bile was conscious and breathing. How did you know that?
Just by communicating with officers at the scene.
Who did you communicate with?
I believe I spoke to PC Smith. I also spoke to Alan Payton as well, just to try and ascertain what had actually happened. At this time I was still completely in the dark to what had actually went on there. What
were you told by PC Smith, first of all?
I can't recall what he's actually said to me. In terms, I think it was just, is everything okay? Are we needing any other staff? Is there any other assistance required? And then it's that point where I spoke to Alan Payton, and he said that the male had not listened to them and had continued walking towards them, and Nicole had been assaulted.
You've then, when you were there at that point, did anyone tell you that Mr. Bile had been prone for a period of time?
No.
Did anyone say anything about thinking he was under the influence of drink or drugs?
No, that assessment really wasn't. I didn't really ask those questions at that time. As I say, I just stopped, made sure everything was okay there, and then moved off to check on PC Short.
Did anyone say there was a question about whether he was having a mental health crisis?
Not at that time, no.
And is there any reason you didn't think to ask those questions?
Mr. Bile, the subject was under control. He was conscious and breathing. There didn't appear to be any other questions I had to ask at that time. Again, split seconds, and then went to check on PC Short, trying to gather a picture of what's happened here.
When you saw that PC Payton and PC Walker had been affected by spray, did you ask any questions about the circumstances that gave rise to that?
Well, PC Payton had said that they'd said to the male to stop, and he'd kept coming at them, and they'd sprayed, and then PC Short had been assaulted.
And did you ask for any more information about the spraying?
No, my priority at that time was to, well, just to establish they were okay, but my priority at the time was to get to Nicole. I didn't know at this time whether she was in a heap, struggling to breathe or whatever. I had no information on that.
Did anyone volunteer at that time that Mr. Bile had been battened to the head?
Not at that time, no.
No. So can I ask you to look at paragraph 11 of your inquiry statement, please? So you say that the risk factor I considered on arrival was whether my officers had control of the perceived subject and what risk he was presenting. Once I assessed whether my officers had control of the subject, who I now know to be Mr. Bile, and determined that they did so, I then assessed whether the restraint of Mr. Bile was causing a risk to my officers or himself. Once I was satisfied that the restraint was not posing a risk, the next issue I considered was what the risks there might be to Mr. Bile and the officers, given that the locus was an active public road.
Yeah.
Another risk factor I considered was the whereabouts of the knife and his race plays no part in my assessment. So you assessed whether the officers had control of Mr. Bio. You determined they did so. And you then assessed whether the restraint of Mr. Bio was causing a risk to my officers or himself. And you were satisfied the restraint was not posing a risk either to the officers or Mr. Bio. Did you consider asking more questions about what had been happening prior to your arrival?
Again, my priority at that time, once I'd established that officers were in full control, there was no injuries there, and from what I looked at the time, he was in handcuffs, in control, and there didn't appear to be any risk to him at that time. My priority was to check on PC Short.
If you'd been given additional information by the officers at this moment about the use of spray, CS and Pava, the baton to the head or body, would that have, and how he'd got onto the ground and the restraint itself and being prone during part of the restraint, would that have affected your assessment of the risk to Mr. Bio?
Potentially, yes. If I'd known that he had been struck to the head with a baton, I would be getting an ambulance straight away.
So if you'd been provided with that information, you would have, how would you have sought that ambulance straight away?
At the end of the day, it's any baton strike to the body would be significant, but if it's to head, you know, with the brain, etc., the trauma that could cause, then unfortunately that's a high priority. We need to get that seen to.
So if you'd been given that information, how soon after you arrived at the scene would it have taken you to transmit for an ambulance?
Pretty much straight away.
Straight away. Right, so you've said that in your state of knowledge at that time your priority was Nicole Short.
Yes.
Tell us where she was.
I believe she was standing next to the custody van. She was sort of bent over, grimacing in pain.
Where was she in relation to, we've heard it called a transit van, we've heard it called a custody van.
Yeah, a transit van. I can't remember exactly her location, if she was in the front or just past it. I could just see her in the background.
She was still out of the van?
Yes.
So you went over to speak to her?
Yes, that's correct.
And what was your assessment of her at the time?
Well, first off was to get some verbal response and see if she was okay. She was clearly in shock, shaken, and I did a very quick visual survey to make sure there was no bleeding or any other significant injuries. Tried to ask her what happened, whereby she said that she's been attacked by the male, kicked and punched, I believe. Again, with my assessment, not seeing anything immediately wrong, it was just to try and get her, because it was raining, to try and get her in the car and just get the ambulance, which I believe I shouted up for after that.
Now you've said kicked and punched. Are you sure she said to you at that time that she'd been kicked and punched?
I can't recall exactly.
Right.
It's clear we're not going to finish this witness's evidence tonight.
Yeah.
If you're now going to explore his dealings with Nicole Short, that might be an appropriate point to...
I'd be obliged. I'm sorry,
yes.
I'm not going to finish.
It was just about 4 o'clock. So if you can come back tomorrow to continue with your evidence, please,
Certainly.
Sergeant.
Thank you.
So we'll rise now till 10 o'clock tomorrow.